Well, good afternoon if you are in New York City. Good morning if you're in Santa Monica, California. Good evening if you are in Baghdad or Paris or Rwanda or places all over the world where this program is followed. Special love to our loved ones in Ukraine, as always. I'm Fred Plotkin. Welcome to Fred Plotkin on Fridays on Adagio, the place where classical music happens. Adagio, as you know by now, is a video and audio streaming platform dedicated to supporting artists and making classical music and opera available to fans all over the world. My guest today is a young man whose work I've heard. I don't know him personally, Llewellyn Sánchez Werner, and he was born in Santa Monica, but has been a New Yorker since the age of 10. He is a pianist, a composer, conductor, teacher, musicologist, real whiz at the musical stuff. And I'm happy to welcome him. He lives very close to Lincoln Center. He lives, I gathered, across the street from where I grew up. So, Llewellyn, welcome.
Oh, it's a pleasure to speak to you. Thanks for having me.
Sure. So I want to start with the fact that you are what was known as a child prodigy. You're an adult now, but you made your piano debut at the age of 6. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's my first piano concerto. It was Haydn C major.
And where did you play that?
I played that in my hometown in Ventura, California, and then I think shortly afterwards with the New West Symphony, I played Beethoven First Piano Concerto. So Haydn and Beethoven, good ways to begin.
Sure, but my question is, how did they find you?
Oh, sure. Well, so I actually had an unorthodox early education. I did essentially my K through 12 at a place called Ventura College, where I took college classes and I did everything from history of Western civilization to English literature to science. And it allowed me to have a very robust and well-rounded education before I would go on later to Juilliard for a much more artistically and musically focused time. And then the orchestra at Ventura College is the orchestra I played the Haydn concerto with, so that's how they got to know me. And everybody treated me like a little brother. It was a very collegial and very fun environment.
So did you enter Juilliard at the age of 10?
At 10 is when I started the pre-college, and then at 14 is when I started the undergrad.
Okay. I hope this question doesn't sound indelicate, but obviously you were on a trajectory from a very early age into the career of music. I've known and worked with other people like that, and they're all people I've found and find incredibly impressive. Did you feel you missed anything in life by being on the trajectory you were?
Well, in a way, I say no because I've always really loved meeting people and hearing their ideas. I've loved making friends, and I've always deeply loved music. And so as long as those things were there, I felt that I didn't miss anything, truly.
What was it like? I mean, I'm saying this and I'm not comparing myself in any way to you, but I was allowed to skip a grade in school when I was in 3rd grade, and then offered the opportunity to skip a 2nd grade when I was in 8th grade.
Mm-hmm.
And I did skip 3rd grade. I chose not to skip 8th grade because I already felt that being a year plus behind everyone else in age, that there was a disconnect. And maybe at Juilliard at the age of 10 and 14, they were better equipped to deal with very young people because they had others like that and knew about the special needs of someone who doesn't shave yet but is already playing in front of big concert halls and so on. But I remember for myself finding quite the social disconnect when I was younger and shorter than everyone else. And I caught up, but it took a very long time, and I don't regret not skipping 8th grade.
Mm-hmm.
But maybe you were with a cohort of other students your age rather than they put you in with 25-year-olds. Is that the case?
Well, there were various ages, but I will admit that I did have a lot of friends who were older than I was, and I relished in this. Actually, I think that some of my earliest mentors actually were just doctoral students who were able to show me new things that I was not yet familiar with, were able to expose me to wonderful ideas. And no, as asynchronous as it may have been, it was really a joy to hear what they had to say. And no, I think if it was in any way something different, I didn't even know it at the time. And it sounds like you felt that way too. It sounds like you really enjoyed your experiences.
Well, I mean, I'll put it in the plainest terms. I have a terrible handwriting, and the reason for that is that they taught penmanship in third grade, and I missed that. And I remember thinking, I wonder what they teach in eighth grade that I'm going to miss if I go from seventh to ninth.
Sure.
And I mean, I'm happy. I'm not complaining. I don't think I missed out too much in third grade apart from the penmanship, but I was aware that I was just a little different from the other kids. And I didn't suffer for that, but I was aware of it. And I went to a specialized high school in New York City with lots of brilliant kids, plus me. And a lot of them had social problems. And I've never asked a young person this before, but I recently had my 50th high school reunion.
Wow.
And a lot of them were complaining about how miserable they were in high school. And these were all people who went on to become ambassadors and scientists and, leading people in their field. We had one of them work in the Obama administration in a high place. And so a lot of very interesting people. But only the fellow who was the ambassador was being diplomatic about his high school experience. But the rest of the people with one glass of wine really began to unburden about what they really felt about the high school and their experience. And, not that childhood and adolescence are always easy and should be, but we all live that experience differently. I knew James Levine very well. He hired me at the Metropolitan Opera.
Wow.
And there was an example of someone who, showed his talent at the age of 5 and was assistant conductor in the Cleveland Orchestra when he wasn't shaving yet. And, went on to do everything that he did. And he had remarkable understanding about everything musical. And he had remarkable understanding about humanity as an extension of the music.
Mhm.
But I don't think he had contact with everyday life. That's not a criticism, but he was not always aware of what people went through in their daily lives
Nice.
unless an operatic character did it. So if Violetta felt sick and, was dispirited and so on, he would understand that through the character. If Rodolfo was having writer's block, he would understand that through the character. But if
Well,
Yeah.
Abraham Lincoln apparently didn't really travel much, but he was a voracious reader. And so it was through a lot of the characters that he read that he got his sense of ethics, which were so profound. So, it is possible to, I guess, get it in a more learned way, but even better is to be in touch with real people. Yeah.
Well, Giuseppe Verdi lived completely out in the country and learned primarily from books, but he also had such a profound humanity and empathy that he looked around and he saw poverty and he saw illness and he saw illiteracy, and that affected him deeply. But that was Verdi. I don't know if Wagner saw that in the same way or if Mozart understood those things. Verdi did. So I take your point about Lincoln, who is magnificent and fascinating, but I'm not saying this to challenge you, but I'm just always interested to know how musicians' lives develop, especially when they're still young, because so much of their life is occupied by music. My dad was a musician. So what I remember as a small child was hours and hours and hours of his practicing every day. And it meant that he was home while my mother was out working. He had me during the day, but he would, stand near my crib or my playpen and practice and practice and practice and practice. And it laid down music for me as my first language, not English, because he didn't speak to me all that much. So music came first and then spoken language more with my mother and other people.
Sure.
You obviously grew up with spoken language, which is a good thing. And you grew up at a different time and place. And I know Juilliard very well, and I know that they take great care of their students and they take great care of the social development of their students. So I'm going to make a bit of a leap, always sticking with Juilliard. One of the many things that I love about Juilliard, especially the former president, Dr. Joseph Polizzi, who I knew very well, is that he was a believer in the artist as citizen. I don't know if you read his book.
Oh,
A lot of every Juilliard student reads The Artist as Citizen. It's a wonderful book. I have a feeling, to the degree that I've gotten to know you, that you absorb that very deeply, that sense of mission, and you make it part of your musical practice. Am I correct?
Absolutely. I mean, yeah, first of all, I love that Joseph Polizzi believed so much in the importance of artists communicating. And he massively expanded the liberal arts curriculum at Juilliard. And I think it helped serve musicians who wanted to write, to speak, to better be in touch with their audiences, and giving them the tools to prepare to do so. But then as far as what has inspired me additionally, I think of how rich a history classical music has in social activism. I mean, I think of Bernstein conducting Beethoven 9 on both sides of the Berlin Wall before it came down, right? Or of some of the mockery of Soviet military themes you hear in the trumpet of Shostakovich's first piano concerto, obviously beyond classical music as well. I mean, I know that there was a Cafe Society nightclub in Greenwich Village that Barney Josephson owned, and that was a place of racial integration, and where Strange Fruit was first sung by Billie Holiday.
Billie Holiday, yeah.
Exactly. When uptown at the Cotton Club, people were still entering through different entrances, depending on the color of their skin, even if they were performing. So, music does have the ability to serve such a purpose. And then in my own humble way, I thought, what can I do to use music in a way that I think will transcend barriers in our world? So I did have the pleasure, the real pleasure of going to Baghdad, Iraq, and performing with the Iraqi National Symphony Orchestra there. And this was a memorable experience for me for many reasons, one of which was that I've never really encountered a more courageous ensemble of people. The conductor had a weapon in his coat pocket during the performance, and there were bulletproof vests that certain members of the orchestra were wearing. Not the string players because of mobility, but wind players. We were rehearsing in the red zone, even though the performance was in the green zone in Baghdad, and we played a diverse concert. We had an American Jewish composer, European composer, Iraqi composer, and we had in the audience American soldiers and Iraqi civilians and ambassadors from various countries. And I remember that the cross-cultural exchange really allowed, I think, for a greater dialogue and a greater sense of healing among all those who were there. And that excited me a lot. I mean, of course, you go for different things in a project like that than you do to play Beethoven Emperor with X orchestra, of course. But it was something that I really remember being inspired by, being inspired by that experience. And yes, of course, there's enough music for 2 lifetimes to play just for its own sake. That's more than enough. But if there's an additional purpose with Polizzi's vision of the artist as citizen, I think go for it. I really do.
There was a journalist named Oriana Fallaci. I don't know if you know the name. And Oriana Fallaci was probably Italy's most famous journalist for a very long time. She originally began quite on the left, and in her lifetime migrated toward the center to extreme right. And I'm not here to talk about her politics now, but what she was known for, among other things, was getting the interview with people that no one else could get the interview with, and for asking the questions, kind of like Americans know Barbara Walters, in a similar way, but even more provocative by far than Barbara Walters. And Oriana Fallaci was the Italian journalist assigned to the first Kennedy Space Center, or I think it was not even called the Kennedy Space Center yet, Cape Canaveral, when the original astronauts were going up into space. And they got to ask a question of the astronauts in the space capsule before it went up. And the American journalists and British journalists would ask things about patriotism and national mission and space and so on. And when they got to the one woman journalist, Oriana Fallaci, the one Italian, she asked the astronauts, one of whom was John Glenn, "Are you scared?" And they sort of found their ability to, say, well, this is an important mission and we're doing this for our country. And they didn't quite answer her question, but you could tell that as a journalist, she was injecting doubt into their thinking as they were, strapped in and about to launch off into space. And so the question, I'm not asking this as a journalist, but if I were to ask you, if you're in the red zone and your conductor is packing heat, so to speak, were you scared?
I think that I wanted to be very aware of what was going on, not just walk into things blindly. But the honest answer is no. And not just because I'm an eternal optimist, but because I really felt passionately about the mission, about what we were trying to do. So, I mean, of course, I wanted to plan things 7 steps in advance and all of that. But I mean, I would do it again, and actually, in other countries have done something like that. Not exactly like that, but yes, I think this is important. This is why we are here.
When you may or may not know this, that I have written a column for many years for WQXR Radio in New York. And my very first column came out at the end of March, I think March 30th of 2011. And the day before, there had been the terrible tsunami in Japan and Fukushima and the nuclear reactor and the meltdown and all of that. And actually, it was about 3 days before. And there was a lot of discussion about whether musicians who were booked to go to Japan would go to Japan. And some did not, and some did. I think one of them was Daniel Harding, the conductor, conducting Mahler, and he said that I'm scheduled to do this and I will do it. John Andre Nozeda, the conductor, went. And I'm not judging those who did or did not go. But in that first column, I coined a term that has now been used a lot, and I'm fine for that. Cultural first responders. When we talk about first responders, we mean the people who are fighting fires, the people who are going into zones where people are injured or ill and taking them out, police officers, nurses, and doctors during pandemics. All those people are first responders. And so I saw these particular musicians as cultural first responders. And I know, because I've studied about you, that you are that. I'm intrigued by the choices you make because, and again, I'm not here to take a political view, but if a person goes into a place where he or she is in the middle of a political situation where some people are pro and other people are con, where let's say there was a civil war with 2 factions, like Rwanda, where you went, and after the civil war ended and the nation set about the healing between the Hutus and the Tutsis, these are very long-standing differences of opinion. I'll use that neutral term about who was right and who was wrong. Do you ever fear being interpreted as being an advocate for one side or the other in such situations?
Oh, I think we have to be very careful about that, actually. I think that, especially because there sometimes, I've had a couple of circumstances where there were journalists not as skilled as you who would ask a question really very clearly trying to get something out of me. And I had to be very careful about that. I think that it's good to be aware of the history, but it's also good to remember that we are trying to be, as you said, cultural first responders, also cultural diplomats. I think a distinction has to be made, though. Like right now with the crisis in Ukraine, if people are playing. I think I saw him in Russia. There was somebody, a violinist, who used a Ukrainian cloth beneath the chin rest, also an LGBTQ cloth or something like that. You know, there's certain overt gestures that we're able to be taking a stand. I think that's a very courageous thing to do. But when you're entering a situation like Rwanda, you know, I think yes, it's good to remember that the music itself serves a larger purpose. Now, I do know that the Tutsis were the victims of the 1994 genocide by the Hutus, and you know, there's I think it's very easy to pick a side in that sense. And you know, meeting with Paul Kagame and remembering the president of Rwanda, you know, all that he had done for the country. But I agree with you completely that in places where the music should be allowed to speak for itself, that should be our priority. I think you make a very good point.
On this program for many months, for more than a year, I've done a shout out to the people of Ukraine who are suffering.
Yeah.
I don't think I've ever said in full disclosure, and I'll say it now, that my family background is half Ukrainian, half Russian.
Wow.
So
Oh my goodness.
I'm not taking a side, but I'm against war and I'm against invasion of people's homes and territories.
Sure.
But I'm very aware that there are millions of Russians who don't support what has happened in the past year and a half, and they don't necessarily feel the freedom or ease to speak.
Yeah.
So that I'm mindful, and this is not an anti-Russian statement when I make that. My father's side is Russian, my mother's side is Ukrainian. But you know, Tchaikovsky loved Ukraine. He was a Russian. His second symphony is known as the Little Russian, and that was his adoption of Ukrainian themes. And I wonder whether in Russia now they're playing Tchaikovsky's Second Symphony, or whether that's been banned. You know, Russia and other countries too, in Africa, Uganda, for example, have taken very active stances against LGBTQ people. But they seem to forget that Tchaikovsky was that.
Right.
So, you know, I always wonder about turning a blind eye towards certain things when it's convenient. You know, same in Israel and same in the Palestinian territories and same in the whole surrounding region. It's fraught. And, you know, I just want to see peace. When I see artists such as Daniel Barenboim and Zubin Mehta go to Israel and spend a lot, or Arturo Toscanini, before that, was the founder of what is now the Israel Philharmonic. Toscanini was a very political figure. Toscanini helped bring Shostakovich's Leningrad Symphony out to the West, have it performed. Do you know this story?
No, I don't actually.
Then I'll tell it now for our listeners, because it's one of my favorite stories. There was what was called the Siege of Leningrad, which lasted 900 days, in which the Nazis invaded Leningrad, now St. Petersburg, and the people of the city very bravely survived, a lot of them, for 900 days. They cut down all the beautiful trees. They would not destroy any of the beautiful palaces and artwork and legacy that was part of their culture, but they literally lived on insects and bugs and grass, and people were starving. And there were attempts to bring in food and medical supplies by the Allies, which were Norway, the United States, but mostly over the Arctic Circle through Norway and maybe into Finland, although Finland was complicated because it was neutral officially. But Norway and the United States and Great Britain were the three that tried to help. And Dmitri Shostakovich, one of my heroes, decided to stay in his city for the whole siege. He could have left, but he decided that he had to be there. And he began to compose a symphony. He didn't have paper, and he got little scraps and bits of paper. And through the help of the United States State Department, I don't know the technology, microfiche or whatever they used at the time in 1942, brought out pieces of the symphonies. He wrote them down, and they were brought out into Norway and then transported to New York, where Arturo Toscanini and the New York Philharmonic paid to have the symphony put together and written out in a score and then printed as a score. And it was apparently somehow approved by Shostakovich, who got to see the printed score. And then Toscanini premiered in 1942 the Leningrad Symphony, which became the most eloquent expression of what the people of Leningrad were enduring. And it was played in 1942, July, I believe, on national radio. I think it was the New York Philharmonic. It might have been the NBC Symphony. I don't want to say the wrong symphony, but it was one of those two, with Toscanini conducting. And Shostakovich wound up on the cover of Time magazine as the emblem of resistance through art. And that's a very short version. I do a lot of lecturing for the New York Philharmonic, and I'm always happy when they ask me to speak on that one because it's such a stirring story and a magnificent symphony. So therefore, and I'm curious about you, see the role for politics in music. Let's not say art for the moment, but music. Fidelio was certainly that, La Clemenza di Tito. There are many political operas. There are many political works that are either overt or by inference about political resistance, survival, whatever. And I believe that these works of art can speak to people in all nations and languages in ways that printed materials cannot.
It's very true. I mean, look at even the Marriage of Figaro. I mean, based on the Beaumarchais text, right? And an opportunity for the servant to be the protagonist, and for there to be a very subtle underpinning of valuing the middle class, but also watching out for censorship from aristocracy. A fascinating libretto and obviously glorious, sublime music to go with it. But there, something that may have been subtle in terms of the way that it came across in the music, but it was felt resoundingly by all. I completely agree, and that's one of the joys of music. I think that it has this power. Yeah.
So I just want to check, when you say servant, do you mean Susanna or Figaro?
Oh, I would say, to be honest, in different ways, both. I mean, the thing, we don't have time to go into some of the details of how complex the opera is, but I would just say that there are themes all throughout it that would have been very well heard. Yeah.
Well, in my view, it's called The Marriage of Figaro, but who is he marrying? To me, Susanna's the protagonist. It's the longest role in the opera. It's about her growth and evolution. It's about her intelligence. She's smarter than all the men around her. She has to avoid the men and somehow keep her job and maintain her dignity. She has to contend with a woman who presumes to marry Figaro until we discover that she's his mother. She supports a countess who is a lovely lady, but very conflicted and sad. And Susanna is deferential in terms of class, but they form a woman's bond of understanding, and they become complicit and helpful to one another. But one of my favorite things in that gorgeous opera is when in the third act, Susanna has to write something, and the Countess sort of encourages her to write. The duet, Zeffiretto Sulari, I think it's called. It's gorgeous music, but also you suddenly see the Countess as the person who's abled, and Susanna feeling inadequate because she can't quite write and read the way the Countess can. It's brilliant. But Don Giovanni is political. To me, the great political opera by Mozart is La Clemenza di Tito, which is about truth and reconciliation. And it was adopted and used in South Africa. They originally considered using Fidelio, but I was a consultant on this. When I explained to them that in my view, what better would speak to the people of South Africa as Nelson Mandela came out of Robben's Island was this concept of truth and reconciliation, which then Bishop Desmond Tutu picked up and used as the words, and it came out of that opera. It was done in Pretoria.
Wow.
So, yeah.
Wasn't there also a Peter Sellers version of Don Giovanni that involved, it was set in the Bronx or something, and at the end, his last meal was a Big Mac, and the ghouls came out from the sewers. There was something about
That'll
class
kill
struggles
you.
in the West. Yeah, right, right.
Well, Peter Sellers, Sellars, wonderful director and producer, did a Mozart da Ponte trilogy in which the Don Giovanni had twin brothers, African American baritones, bass baritones, the Perry brothers, I forget their first names, and they were very persuasive as being Leporello and the Don because they looked alike. And it was set in the South Bronx, and there was drug use and so on. Così fan tutte was set in a diner, I believe, in New Jersey or Long Island.
Ah.
And this goes way back before a certain person became famous. The Marriage of Figaro was set in the Trump Tower. Did you know that?
No, I didn't. But I saw Julius Caesar in Shakespeare in the Park, and he came
Right.
out in a very long red tie with an oddly Eastern European accent for his wife. So this is
Right.
apparently a common theme. I did not know that. That's
That
crazy.
was more recent, but Peter Sellers, I think, did this in the late 1980s.
Wow.
And so Trump Tower is a gaudy palace. And, you know, Cherubino was walking around, he was 14 and carrying a hockey stick. And there were servants and maids and all of that, and an unhappy wife, and the lord of the mansion, let's say it, who had a wandering eye. This was in the 1980s. This was well before Donald Trump moved into public housing a few years ago. I know that you played for Barack Obama twice.
Right. Yes.
Talk about that.
Oh, sure. No, I played for President Obama and for President Biden, and really, it was an incredibly memorable experience. I mean, first of all, I think that we think of President Obama as a great orator and as being a very, very noble statesman. I think that we also sometimes need to remember how warm he is as a person, as is First Lady Obama and the two daughters Malia and Sasha. I did not get to meet Bo, however, which was my great regret. Bo's the dog.
Portuguese water dog. Yeah.
There you go. Exactly. No, but of course, a tremendous honor to be at the White House and then to be at the Kennedy Center for his second inauguration concert. So I'll remember that forever.
Well, again, I'm not getting political here, but among the things that I greatly admire about Barack Obama, number one, I admire everything about Michelle Obama without hesitation. But Mr. Obama smokes, so he's not perfect. But one of the things I really admire about him, he's a great reader.
Yes.
And he's an advocate for reading in books and learning from books and reading widely and not simply focusing on biographies of former presidents and generals, right, but really having his pulse on the culture through books. President Biden is more a reciter of poetry. I have a feeling that President Biden is a closet theater lover, and he just doesn't talk about that. It's a shame that many of our presidents and their families are very into culture, but they have not necessarily been able to do that. When I was performance manager of the Met in the 1980s, I regularly had visits that were both official but private from Nancy Reagan, who loved opera and loved coming to the opera. And her husband, not so much, but she really loved opera. And we would arrange that, without fanfare, that she would come and enter a particular entrance, and I'd have tea with her in the company dining room, not in a fancy way, in the canteen. We had a special box for her and seats for her and her security, and she would attend and leave, and she was no bother whatsoever. And she would always talk to me about the operas. And we would talk about politics and opera, because one time she came for Aida. The Clintons later came for Aida. And we were talking about Aida not from the point of view of spectacle, but of nationhood. And she was very, not only conversant, but very sophisticated in her perceptions of that. And while there are many things I disagreed with her, and especially her husband, about, she didn't bring that when she came. She brought an openness about the arts. I know that George Bush Sr. and Barbara Bush loved opera, but they felt that politically it was not to their benefit to talk about that, so that they didn't.
So does that mean that not since the Kennedys has it been politically wise to be openly cultured and loving of opera?
Well,
Maybe
I
it's just
think that Lyndon Johnson was the one who helped really build the Kennedy Center. Eisenhower, obviously, unfortunately, President Kennedy had died, but President Eisenhower before him was a great supporter of the arts and was the one who, in a way, made it happen. President Eisenhower, and I know this date, May 14th, 1959, came to New York, very close to where you are now, where you went to school, and he and Leontine Price did the proverbial first dig in the ground with the first shovel to build Lincoln Center, and they built it more or less where the North Plaza is, which is facing Juilliard and near the library and so forth. So he certainly was. Richard Nixon loved the piano and played the piano a lot, and vastly increased the budget for the arts. Jimmy Carter respected and understood the art, understood the value of the arts. He was not a promoter in the same way. Gerald Ford's wife, Betty Ford, had danced with the Martha Graham Dance Company. And I didn't know you were going to ask me all this, but here we go. And therefore, she was a great supporter of dance and ballet and so forth. And during her time, there was all of that. Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis, who lived, I believe, to 1994, if I remember, was a huge supporter of the arts, of poetry, of cultural preservation. Growing up in New York, then she was like our queen, that she would appear and confer upon an event her imprimatur. And when I worked at the Met, we also had American Ballet Theater, and she was the honorary chair of ABT. And so I would work with her in promotion. She was a book editor for Viking and one other company, but for Viking, and therefore promoted books and art books and so forth. So all of these people, Barbara Bush and George Bush Sr., grew up with the arts. I'm leaving someone out. Oh, well, Ronald Reagan. I spoke about Ronald and Nancy. Ronnie was a movie actor. Right. He understood the importance of the arts and so on, but Nancy really did. And then after that, the Bushes, and then the Clintons. The Clintons were the ones who really wanted to expand the budget a great deal for the National Endowment for the Arts. At that time in the 90s, I worked for the NEA, but Newt Gingrich, who was Speaker of the House, who loves opera. And I spoke to him directly because my job was lost because he deleted my job and others because he felt that it would not speak to their constituency well to fund the arts because there was a question about certain things being controversial. I asked Newt Gingrich what his favorite opera was, and he said Rigoletto. And I said, why? He said, because it's a family opera. I didn't want to tell him it's rape and incest and murder and kidnapping and all that, but for him it was a family opera. So unfortunately, in the Clintons' time, some of the money was lost. George Bush Jr. and his wife Laura was, like Barbara Bush, a great advocate for reading and literacy, so they promoted more the humanities than the performing arts. But George Bush Jr., at that time, when there were the Kennedy Center honors, welcomed Ossie Davis and Ruby Dee, and I believe Pete Seeger. There were people who politically would not necessarily jive, but he was big enough to understand that you don't have to agree on everything, and that the arts are important. The Obamas hugely important in terms of supporting the arts, not necessarily the classical arts, right, but the arts in general. And then, unfortunately, in the Trump administration, they came to a screeching halt. They managed to keep the budget for the arts, not increase the budget. And now President Biden is an advocate for the arts. His wife is a teacher who specializes in literacy, professor, not teacher. And so, therefore, apart from the glitch of Trump, it's really not about liberal, conservative, whatever. It's about the value and the importance of art in our society. You and I know, and people in other countries may not have heard of something called the STEM curriculum: science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. And I'm an advocate for the STEAM curriculum, where you put the
Yeah.
arts in there, because I believe that if you study music, even if we don't become like you, a professional musician, but if you grow up with music, with theater, with language, with visual arts, with dance, whatever you prefer, all of this creative thinking informs your approach to science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. When you were growing up and when you were a student at Juilliard, did that enter your reality, the STEM part, or were you really A for arts?
I have a couple of things to say. First of all, just going back to what you were saying before, and that was a fascinating summation of how each president handled the art situation. I also wanted to point out that on the Supreme Court, weren't Ruth Bader Ginsburg and Antonin Scalia always on the opposite side of issues, but always coming
But they
together to talk
loved
about
opera.
I think she went
Yeah,
to the Met premiere, not the original premiere, but the Met premiere of The Death of Klinghoffer,
yeah.
a decade ago or so.
Which, for people who don't know, is an opera by John Adams about an event that happened in which Palestinians boarded a cruise ship and killed an elderly disabled man who happened to be Jewish. He was in a wheelchair, and his wife survived, but her medical condition, her mental and medical condition, really never recovered, and she died prematurely. There was a lot of outrage about the fact that this opera would be done. I'm in favor of doing operas like that. It tried to approach the Palestinian viewpoint on that part of the world.
It had
I'm not
both.
taking
There was a chorus of exiled
of
Palestinians.
Palestinians, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
And I'm not taking sides here, but I'm happy that I think her name was Alice Goodman was the librettist, and she was Jewish, but she converted to Methodism or some British Protestant religion, and is now actually a religious figure in the United Kingdom. And John Adams wrote the music, and yeah, we have to deal with these things, and art can deal with these things, I believe, and music can. And if people are just such fraidy cats that they can't stand up and face that, whatever side you're on, again, I'm not being left, right, center here at all. I'm just saying that if you find something uncomfortable because it doesn't comport with your particular viewpoint, it doesn't mean that you can't explore another viewpoint. And art often does that a lot better than talking heads on television, I think.
Absolutely. And that night, by the way, just as a fun story, I was there. I got a ticket for that Met premiere, and I remember outside there were protesters carrying signs that said "tenors and terrorists don't mix." And I remember that there were sound bites from different mayors of New York. De Blasio said we have to have the opera. Giuliani said there's no way this opera should be allowed to be performed. And in the premiere, there were people booing, and then people booing the people who were doing the original booing. It was a fascinating experience, but it was the talk of the town. And I mean, how often does that happen? That everybody was talking about what was going on in Lincoln Center. So I agree with you. It's enlightening for this to happen.
Well, I do want to amplify something you just said.
Yeah.
You attended the premiere of The Death of Klinghoffer, as did I, but that was not the opening night of the Met season.
No. It premiered way back in Brooklyn and then in Brussels or something, I think.
No, but what I'm saying is it was not the opening night of the Met season. When the Met presented it, let's say it was November, but the Met opened in late September. And there were protests on opening night of the Met season about The Death of Klinghoffer, even though that was not the opera on the stage that night.
Wow.
And I was arriving for opening night of the season, which, if my memory serves, I didn't research this for you, but it was Le Nozze di Figaro. And so I went and spoke to some of the people who were protesting, and I said, "What's your problem with the opera?" And they said, "Well, it's anti-Jewish." And I said, "I don't know if Mozart and De Ponte were pro or anti-Jewish, because De Ponte was part Jewish." "Well, who are Mozart and De Ponte?" I said, "They wrote tonight's opera." "No, they're doing The Death of Klinghoffer." "No, they're not. They're doing that in November." Now we're doing The Marriage of Figaro, which is even more political than the death of Klinghoffer.
That's an incredible story.
Yeah, I will have to look it up and I'll let you know. But I remember vividly seeing
Yeah.
demonstrations just across from Lincoln Center Plaza. They were not allowed on the plaza, but they were on Columbus Avenue, with loudspeakers and so on, knocking the Met, knocking opera, knocking Peter Gelb, general manager of the Met, and all these people. And, they were protesting against Mozart on that particular night. But so let me ask you another question then. Given that we understand your sense of importance and something I share with you about the artist as citizen, talk to me about yourself, the artist as artist.
Yes.
That there are many, 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 many works that are part of your repertory that are not necessarily political and are not necessarily about extending a message, but maybe a term I love that my father used all the time, pure music.
Absolutely.
I think that most of what you occupy your time with is pure music.
That's absolutely correct. I think that, oh my gosh, I mean, there's so much great music to continually study, but one period that is always close to my heart, I think, would be high classicism, late Beethoven, late Schubert. That's something always very dear to my heart. And this does not mean, by the way, that I'm not playing a whole lot of Debussy and Rachmaninoff. And I just a few days ago did a world premiere by Curtis Stewart in Newport, Rhode Island. Lots of different types of music. But I think that, yes, maybe we can talk a little bit now about maybe Mozart or Beethoven. I mean, okay, let's say Mozart because we were talking about Marriage of Figaro. One thing,
Beethoven's good too.
Beethoven's good too. It is good too. One thing about Mozart, and I'm curious for your thoughts on this as well. The controversy of how much to embellish what's on the page, because, for example, there's different piano concerti that don't necessarily have cadenzas written in Mozart's hand because, frankly, he didn't have the time to write them. So then, what do? Do we play a cadenza written by Brahms? Do we play a cadenza written by somebody else? Or is there a chance perhaps to write our own, which is something that I really love to do whenever I play a Mozart concerto? Is that something that Mozart would have approved of? Absolutely, because we know that he improvised.
Yeah, I think so too.
Always in the spirit of creation. But then, digging a little deeper, what about moments in slow movements of concerti in which there are, maybe some quarter notes and eighth notes that are not quite as fleshed out as they could be, clearly asking, begging, pleading for some sort of little subtle ornamentation, a little Eingang somewhere. Is that something that's possible? And then maybe a step, the furthest step out would be something that Robert Levin, the great keyboardist and musicologist, would argue, as that are there times when even in the actual score, do you connect a few dots? So he gives a great example of a piano concerto, and I want to be careful to say the key because I don't want to be wrong, but there's a concerto in which for 16 bars, there are just 4 quarter notes, every bar, all in different parts of the keyboard, high, low, low, high. And he said that he finds it very humorous when sometimes people will, with great diligence and dutiful intention, play each note with such profundity instead of, in his view, realizing that actually they're meant to be connected by scalar passages to sound just like a lot of other filigree would in his concerti. I think that with Mozart, there's the unique opportunity to have endless creative possibilities be explored, while obviously always being very stylistically true to his intention. And I'm curious what you think about this, because I know that, for example, at Marlborough, Rudolf Serkin was not a fan of this kind of thing. For him, if you added even one thing that was not directly on the page, it was a sacrilegious endeavor. So anyway, yeah, what do you think?
I'm not dodging your question.
Yeah.
I'm not a pianist, but I will answer it with what I think is a pretty fair answer.
Yes.
I know that you have played at the Verbier Festival in Switzerland.
That's right.
I have twice been a scholar in residence in the Verbier Festival, and the first time was in 2012. and got to lecture on all kinds of topics. And in addition, do master classes with the soprano Ileana Kotrubash, with the wonderful baritone Thomas Allen, with the magnificent bass baritone Thomas Kwasthoff. So I was in the vocal arts part of it. I got to do an evening with, I'm suddenly forgetting her first name, the daughter of Ravi Shankar, Anushka Shankar, about the evolution of stringed instruments from India to Spain. But in addition, when we were not teaching, we got to go to everyone else's classes. And the magnificent, to me, Alfred Brendel was in residence. And although I'm not a pianist, I went to every single master class that he did. And Alfred Brendel's books are wonderful. To me, his playing of those classics by Mozart, Beethoven, Schubert are impeccable. I'm not saying they're the best, because there is no best, but I think that he tried to find what would have been the original intention. And that whatever the original intention would be, to honor that, but maybe the original intention in his view is close to what you're saying. I'm not saying that he was come escrito, as written, and that everything just had to be the way we are left it by the composer. But the way he would teach and describe was to encourage the pianist with him to find his or her own way into the notes, and rather than impose his own view. And he never would sit down, although we all wanted him to, and say, well, this is how I would play this, because it was at that point that he had basically retired as a performer and had become a teacher. And he very carefully, scrupulously was avoiding playing in front of the audience, which is what everybody wanted. It's like when Leontine Price taught master classes at Juilliard. She was in her 70s and everybody wanted to sing just one note, please, just one note. But she didn't do it, because she would say, it's not about me. And it sounded a bit grand, but she meant that. It was not about her. And similarly with Alfred Brendel. Have you read Brendel's books on this repertory and on performance practice?
To be honest, I have not, and I should be sure to do so.
They're treasures. They're just, although Austrian German is his first language, his English is so wonderful and humorous and wry that this is not, sometimes musicological writing is pretty dry, but this is anything but that. I'm going to pick up on something you said, because it's something I care about too. The second movements of Mozart Piano Concerti, I believe maybe there is stuff that's written, I've not really read it, but someone needs to do just a book or an essay or a concert program about the second movements, because they're the ones that really just grab me.
Absolutely.
Nothing wrong with the first and the third, but I always find that the second movements is where Mozart, in all of his music, the symphonies, the operas, is at his most eloquent, is in the 27 piano concerti. For me, most especially the 23rd, Commercial 488, which I discovered many, many years ago. I went to a French film, and it was, I don't remember the film, but in the middle of the film, the music began to play from the second movement of Commercial 488. And I didn't know what that was. And I was so bowled over by the music that I lost track of the movie. And I stayed to read all the credits, as I often do. And it was Murray Pariah playing.
Wow.
So at that time, we had Tower Records on 67th Street, and the movie was on 63rd Street. I walked up to Tower Records and bought the recording that I just heard. And my problem, let's say now, with that concerto is that I'm so deeply attached to it that I can't listen to it when a pianist I don't know takes it on. And I've heard every fine pianist since then play it at a certain point, Alicia de la Rocha forward. And I have to divorce myself from that music. I know every note. I cannot listen to it, not because it makes me suffer, but it's just too intimate to me. And there are no surprises yet. And that's a way of answering your question too, is that I would like each pianist to find his or her own connection to the pacings, the dottings, the tempi, and so on, and tell me something about themselves through that music. Obviously, it would be nice to play all the notes right, but within that context, to tell me something in a way about how they connect to it. Not that they have to interpret Mozart for me, but if they deeply connect to something, then do it. And I would only further add that every musician I know feels certain music incredibly deeply and other music not at all or very little. And they say, no, I don't play that piece because I just don't feel it. And that's fine for me. So that Alfred Brendel may have played all kinds of things, but the fact that he was very anchored in Mozart, Beethoven, and Schubert is fine with me.
Right. I think of additional interest is what personal statements people can find, not just in the music, but also in the literature that supports that music. And for that, I make a quick turn to the Romantic era, and I think of Schumann and of Liszt. I mean, I know that Schumann was always interested in those aphorisms of Jean Paul, and obviously he wrote about Eusebius Florestad, Master Raro, those different embodiments of his own, of the characters inside of him. And then, of course, with Liszt, there's so many examples. I mean, the Dante Sonata, obviously based on the Divine Comedy, right? Mazeppa, based on a Ukrainian legend, by the way, since you are part Ukrainian, which is written about in an epic poem by Lord Byron, and then in a much shorter poem by Victor Hugo. I think that there's,
and then by Stephen Sondheim in the musical Gypsy.
Really?
First I was a schlepper, now I'm Miss Mazeppa.
No
I'm not
way.
kidding. Yeah, she was
I
a
have to
stripper.
check that out.
First I was a schlepper, now I'm Miss Mazeppa with my revolution and dance.
It's a great story too, by the
Yeah.
way. I mean, it's a bit fantastical, right? The idea that this man being dragged by a horse that he's tied to would survive more than a few seconds on this
Yep.
really rocky terrain. And of course, in the story, this goes on for days and days, and he has visions from the stars. But an incredible story, I think, that also really mirrors the resilience of the Ukrainian people right now, and Zelensky. But anyway, so regarding literature and music, yes, I think that what stories people can find to evoke programmatic stories also can be very compelling.
So you mentioned Liszt.
Yeah.
At that time in the mid to late 19th century, Paganini on the violin and the viola and Liszt on the piano were often assumed to have somehow connected with or summoned the devil.
Right.
And the devil in music. And I know that it's something that you've been occupying yourself with lately.
Sure. You mean finding the devil in music?
Well, find the devil in music, and also the Day of the Dead.
Oh, sure. Oh,
Halloween,
absolutely.
and yeah.
Yes. Well, so I am excited that in really not too long from now, the end of October, I think, what is it, the 19th through the 22nd, the 26th through the 29th, and then the 31st and November 1st, I'll be doing concerts in Brooklyn about the Day of the Dead, about Dia de los Muertos. And
We're in Brooklyn.
At the Brooklyn Art House, which is spelled
Okay.
Haus. It's a new venue that I think they're trying to make into the next Poisson Rouge or National Sawdust type of place. And for that, there will be a really, first of all, a diverse program. We'll have a lot of focus on Mexican repertoire, music of Carlos Chavez and Manuel Ponce, who I'll talk about in a moment. Those are classical Mexican composers. Then popular songs like Bésame Mucho by Consuelo Velasquez, or Jarabe Tapatío, the Mexican hat dance, and I'll go into that as a little bit as well. Then a couple of just macabre, fantastical, devilish pieces like Saint-Saëns, Dance Macabre, and Liszt's Dante Sonata. But the music will be joined by choreography, by shadow puppetry, by a lot of coloristic, kaleidoscopic effects around, which will hopefully provide a new dimension to the music that they're hearing and celebrate not only the darkness of the holiday, but also the warmth, the family friendly quality, the sense of unity and togetherness that Dia de los Muertos, the Day of the Dead, brings. And I'm excited about this project because, I mean, that's part of my heritage. I'm a man of diverse heritage. I have a German Jewish, I have Welsh, but I also have a Mexican coming from my mom. And so that's where the Sanchez comes from in my name.
Like Anthony Quinn.
There you
Anthony
go.
Quinn, the actor, was part Mexican, part Irish.
Wow, amazing. And by the way, such literary countries too. I mean, both gave us incredible. I mean, I think Ireland has a lot of Nobel laureates
Yeah.
in literature, right? Yeah, yeah.
Yep.
But anyway, but these are fascinating people. I mean, first of all, the Jarabe Tapatio, and I'll be playing an Earl Wild virtuosic arrangement of it. You know, people think of this piece of the Mexican hat dance as sort of this fun thing to hear. I don't know, on Cinco de Mayo or something, you know, with a margarita. But the history of it is a lot deeper. Back in the early 1800s, it was a song and dance, in particular of protest against colonization from the Spanish Empire, and it started in Jalisco, which is actually the region where my mom is from. Guadalajara is the biggest city in Jalisco, but it then grew to national popularity, and I think it is raucous and festive, and should be celebrated as such. And then, of course, there are the classical composers like Chavez and Ponce. Well, I'll start with Ponce because he was first. He is part of a fascinating pedagogical lineage that goes back. Beethoven taught Czerny, who taught Liszt, who then taught a man named Martin Krauss. And one of Martin Krauss's other students was the great Chilean pianist Claudio Arrau, but also studying
My favorite Chopin pianist.
A master. But
Yep.
studying alongside Claudio Arrau with this man was Manuel Ponce, a Mexican composer known for idyllic melodicism, for very catchy tunes, songs that were sung around the country. Estrellita, which is, I think, played by Heifetz and so many violinists since then, has a very popular encore piece. But Ponce is buried, along with his student Chavez, in the National Rotunda of Illustrious Persons in Mexico City. And that's where Mexico buries some of their great statesmen, politicians, artists, scientists, generals, this and that. And so he was a big player for sure. But then, of course, if he embodied this kind of marriage of the folk and classical traditions in Mexico, then in his student Carlos Chavez, you see a much more Stravinsky-esque type of writing. And so Chavez was fascinating. If I can just talk about him for a moment as a
Sure.
fan.
Yeah.
He founded the modern versions of the National Orchestra and the National Conservatory in Mexico City. The modern versions. His, I think, Sixth Symphony was commissioned by Leonard Bernstein for the opening of Lincoln Center. He gave Norton lectures at Harvard. He was a very close friend of Aaron Copland. And there's a great picture, by the way, which I'll send you after this, of Chavez with Copland, Stravinsky, Claire Booth Luce, all in a room, just having a glass of wine together. And then another great picture of Chavez with his two compatriots, Frida Kahlo and Diego Rivera, also very close personal friends. And I think they saw each other as being of the same kind of intention, but just in different art forms. And so that was who he was. And actually, Chavez, he also curated a series at the at MoMA, Museum of Modern Art. I think 20 centuries of Mexican art is what it was called, going way back into ancient times, obviously. And he curated the music to go along with it, but for a lot of Frida Kahlo's work, he programmed himself because he found that kind of stylistic symmetry. So anyway, this is a fascinating man. He wrote a book, Toward a New Music, which talks about Mexican music, but also its place in the world and electronic music. Anyway, so one of the reasons that I love Carlos Chavez also is his piano concerto, which I have performed a few times, and I think really deserves to be heard as one of the great 20th century undiscovered gems of the piano concerto repertoire. It has a bristling, relentless, and exciting percussivity. It has haunting, use of instruments to evoke Aztec or Zapotec themes. Um, and intervals. It has using octosonicism, but also a great deal of modality. It has a fascinating musical language, and it's also just very exciting. I mean, the finale is virtuosic, filled with really devilishly difficult virtuosic runs for the piano, and by the way, also for the brass and the winds. But anyway, so his piano concerto is great, but then I'll have some of his solo music in the Dia de los Muertos program. So I'm really hoping that these programs in Brooklyn will showcase some popular and folk sides of Mexican music for people who know these songs like Bésame Mucho. It'll feature some part of the Mexican tradition for those who are interested in discovering more about that. And just seeing the piano be used for all the dynamism that of course it has. And then, a little bit of non-Mexican as well. So that's why I think that the Dance Macabre of Saint-Saëns and the Dante Sonata of Liszt fit in so well with the theme. And I've also very much enjoyed working with Anita Cardenas, who is the one in charge of the choreography and the shadow puppetry. And I'm really excited about that. Yeah.
I'll tell you why I asked where in Brooklyn, because Brooklyn has a very famous, very beautiful cemetery called Greenwood.
Sure.
It's Green-Wood. Leonard Bernstein is buried there. Lots of people who could be buried anywhere in the world chose to be buried at Greenwood Cemetery. It's very large. It's very beautiful. It's from a time when people would go to commune with the dead and sit by the graves and tend the gravestones and so on. And a friend of mine, Andrew Owsley, or Ousley, I never know how he pronounces it, Ousley, produces a series of what are called crypt concerts, in which he uses locations there, but also in other cemeteries and cathedrals and so on around the city, that are sepulchral, that have a different acoustic, and make for unusual places to go. I'm a friend of the soprano Catherine Malfitano, and she and I and her husband went to one of these in Brooklyn a few years ago, and it was rather remarkable being inside a tomb hearing an opera. And I mention that because maybe in the future you want to explore these settings acoustically, not because there are dead people around. That's fine, whatever people feel about that is fine. But acoustically, a lot of these places are rather remarkable, and Andrew understood that, which is why he created something that didn't really exist before, of these crypt concerts. That, if you're claustrophobic, it is not a good place to be. But
it's funny you mentioned this, because I was invited to do one a couple of months ago back in July, but the scheduling did not work out because of 9 concerts I was doing at the Newport Music Festival. So I'm hopeful that we'll be able to find a new date for it. It's a fantastic idea. I really love what they're doing there.
Yeah. A whole other area of study that I love doing, and I'm betting you would too, is the recreation of concerts from the past. I was working in Paris, I forget the month, but I would say March or April of 1999. And I was staying near the Church of the Madeleine, which is in the 8th arrondissement. It's a very good food shopping district, but it's also a church that is not the most beautiful in Paris, but it has a lot of history and great music programming. And I walked by one day and they said Chopin's funeral. And I thought, what do you mean Chopin's funeral? And apparently it was 150 years to the date after his funeral in the Church of the Madeleine in 1849. And they recreated the combination of Chopin music, French music, and Polish music that was played, and I think a little bit of Bach, that was played at Chopin's funeral. And I was with a dear friend of mine from Italy, and she joined me, and we went to Chopin's funeral. And obviously he was not there, but to evoke I don't know if you know about him, that he was buried in Paris, but had his heart buried in Poland.
I did hear this.
I wrote an article about this years ago, and his heart got lost and had to be, during either the communist or the Nazi occupation, someone stole Chopin's heart,
Oh
and it had to
no.
be courageously captured again and preserved and so on. And now it's back where it belongs. But these stories of events that happened in history that seem interesting and historic and not of our time, but they can be of our time. And whoever is coming up soon, Puccini, actually, the centennial of his death is coming in 2024 in November, I believe. And I'm going to be interested to see how Puccini is commemorated. I taught a course at Adagio recently about him, and he was a brilliant composer, but mixed figure as a man. And but nonetheless, there's something about his music, his characters, and so on, that I think that Puccini merits revisiting, because his opera is kind of like those, the Mozart 23rd Piano Concerto for me, are a bit calcified and in aspic and need to be liberated and revisited. And I think maybe it's time for that. But, as you look at your future plans, look at composers you care about and see who has an anniversary coming up, and then select something from his or her life that we may have forgotten about and merits revisitation.
Excellent
I
idea.
think, because you know what, that will also, you'll always have programming.
Right.
Much as we love to hear you play all the great piano classics, people are looking for a particular program. That's why I'm interested in your homage of the Halloween and the Day of the Dead that's coming up, because that too can be a bit corny, but it can also be absolutely fascinating.
Right. It depends on how it's done, of course. I think that Martha Argerich had a quote that programming is half the battle. That's half of your recital. And if you have a bad program, then you might as well just close up. And I completely agree. I think that with programming, you really have to tell a story. And I will confess that I don't want to say I agonize, but I really think a lot about my programs before sending them out to presenters or my manager or whatever. Because I know what an impact that has, and clearly we agree. Yeah.
Well, Martha Argerich, who I revere, may have said it was 50% programming. Julia Child, the great chef and food writer and much more, she appeared on an American postage stamp, which means you're really someone important, said that good cooking is 85% shopping.
Right, sure.
And she was right. If you select the right food, then they do it themselves. All you have to do is stand out of their way and honor the onion, honor the piece of beef, honor the cheese. And if you know their properties, it's like a musician understanding what's behind the notes and in the notes and between the notes. If you understand their properties, then you let them speak for themselves.
Absolutely.
You are also a composer.
Yes.
Talk to me about that.
Sure. So I had the great pleasure of studying with Lowell Lieberman for several years. Somebody who is a composer I greatly admire, and I treasure.
I will parenthetically say that Lowell was on this program a couple of years ago. We're old friends.
Oh, great.
And people can go to either adagio.com and find it, or go to YouTube and enter Fred Plotkin, Lowell Lieberman, and you can find that.
Oh, terrific. But I think that while a lot of my composing has centered around the piano, I've also done other instrumentations, especially chamber music with winds, songs with singers, and a little bit of orchestration as well. But I think that I really enjoy performing my own pieces because there's an opportunity to express something very personal and intimate, obviously, in a way that's it's not better or worse, but just different than playing the music of others. But I will also say that arranging can be something that I really enjoy doing. I mean, obviously, we talked about Liszt before, and he was famous for having done so much arranging and transcribing. I mean, all those great paraphrases of opera themes and transcribing the complete Beethoven symphonies for solo piano. So, looking at a lot of those as studies, I've done a lot of arranging of pieces for orchestra for the piano, including actually one that will be on the upcoming program in Brooklyn by Manuel Ponce, the Balada Mexicana. But in addition to outright composing, I also enjoy improvising a lot. And then I did study this with a brilliant man named Noam Saban at Juilliard, and I think that is something that can be really fun. We're taking a couple of notes from the audience and then improvising a fugue as a fun encore, or just having an opportunity also to get into certain kinds of modern, very accessible styles that help us just reach people in additionally effective ways. I think improvising allows us to know our instrument better. And I did, and it goes back a long way. I mean, obviously people used to improvise a lot. I read a treatise of C.P.E. Bach about keyboard playing, in which he talks about improvising in great detail. I think that I definitely have had an opportunity to learn more about the sound possibilities and the harmonic richness of my instrument through improvising. And the only other thing I will say, even though it's off topic, but because I know we're talking about composition and improvisation, but speaking of ways of knowing your instrument, during the pandemic, I also learned how to tune my own piano. And for those who don't know, this is not something that pianists usually do. It usually, whereas of course string players are tuning themselves every 5 minutes. But I had to fix a broken string and add a little bit of solution to a fulcrum, and obviously learn a lot about really listening to the harmonics, to the partials, to the stretch in the upper and lower parts of the keyboard and the piano, and that has been, that was a great I think it was a fun thing to do during the pandemic, also because then now when I'm going anywhere to play, I have much more specific comments to give to technicians. So all this is to say that I like finding ways to just learn more and more about music, as you do, Fred, very obviously.
When my father retired as a performer, he played the trombone beautifully. In part, he made that decision because he didn't want to travel constantly, be away from me.
Sure.
And so he did music editing and music publishing and so on, where you would send him a Mahler symphony and he'd read the score and say, no, I think this is a C natural, not a C sharp, that kind of thing.
Sure.
But he also learned to be a piano tutor. So when I was a kid, he would take me along and I would, be 8 or 9 and sit near or under the pianos of a lot of the most important pianists in New York, or opera singers who had a piano in their home. And in the case of Licia Albanese, the wonderful Italian soprano, she said, don't sit with your father. You come in the kitchen with me. And she taught me to make a lot of Italian pasta dishes. And that was the beginning of my learning to cook from a real Italian. And it was fascinating going around into the homes. There was a comedian many years ago named Alan King, very famous in America, and he lived on Long Island. And my father took me to Alan King's house, and Alan King smoked cigars. And while my dad was tuning, Alan King would have me in the other room smoking, testing out his jokes, his material on a 10-year-old. I didn't understand anything he was talking about. And he said, you got no future in the performing arts. And I said, well, we'll see. But I know I was born the same, not same year, but I share a birthday with Fred Astaire, for whom I was named.
Oh, wow.
Who do you share a birthday with? I happen to know.
Well, I share a birthday with George Gershwin and with Serena Williams, September 26th.
Oh, well. And which one will you be honoring in the near future with your artistry?
For the anniversary? I know Gershwin's anniversary is coming up, and no, I mean, look, already a couple of Rhapsody in Blues on the schedule, but I hope that in addition to Rhapsody in Blue, there are some concerto in F, because the orchestration for that is brilliant. And look, I mean, Gershwin we all know what an incredible composer who should be enjoyed for his fun and for his sincerity and for his wonderfully vibrant music, but should also be respected, I think, really respected for the masterful composer that he was.
Yeah. I didn't plan to talk a lot about my dad, but we are.
Yeah.
Gershwin was born, I believe, in 1898, and he died in 1937. My father was born in 1923. And my dad, by 1936, was playing professionally at the age of 13. And my father's favorite composers and it took me a while to figure this out, were Gershwin, Ravel, Stravinsky, Debussy, Berg,
Whoa,
and oh yeah, my first opera was Wozzeck.
fantastic.
And and what I didn't quite put together until later on, he was still around, thankfully, was that and Puccini was another, was that the composers he loved were the living composers of his childhood. Because I grew up on Beethoven, Wagner, Verdi, Rossini, Berlioz, Donizetti, Mozart, Handel, the usual suspects, Schumann, Brahms, everybody, Mahler a bit later. But I always realized later that my father, unlike me, I grew up on composers of the past. He grew up on composers who were alive and creating and composing, Prokofiev, another one.
Wow.
And so therefore, I always found that very interesting, because I don't know too many 13-year-olds or 16-year-olds now whose main focus is Philip Glass or Steve Reich or I'm suddenly forgetting his name in England, Harrison, the wonderful composer.
Oh, Lou Harrison.
Lou Harrison, yes.
Wrote a great organ concerto.
Yeah. But I don't know how many kids, those are the ones who turn them on.
Sure.
I mean, maybe Stravinsky turns them on, which is fine. But it was very rare, now that I think about that. So when you were a 6-year-old, who were you listening to?
So I have an interesting answer for this. A little bit of a Benjamin Button situation, that my taste has expanded more and more as I have gotten older. That's the weird part. That when I was a little kid, it was like Beethoven immediately made sense to me. I found a deep kinship with him for reasons that I can go into in a moment. But I think then along the way, oh wow, Stravinsky, Prokofiev, this is fascinating music. Oh wow, Wagner. I didn't quite understand him as much when I was 11 or 12, but now, oh boy, now I see what all the hype is about.
Oh boy,
And
indeed.
and then of course going into jazz, and Coleman Hawkins and Bill Evans and Thelonious and everything else, and obviously a lot of modern music as well. I think that every year I start to open my mind and my ears even more to styles that I wouldn't have known, which I hope continues, because sometimes obviously we see a lot of people who get more closed-minded as they get older. So if I'm right now, I'm on the track to when I'm 100 years old, liking everything that's ever been written. But no, but I think that with Beethoven, there was a very deep love. Also, because not only is that music, especially in his late period, so profound and sublime and transcendent, but it also represents the dignity of the human spirit. I mean, I think that there was a wonderful quote, and I have to remember who said it. Ari, you've already told it to me, but I don't know who told him. But it was that if Mozart is descending from heaven, Beethoven is working his whole life to get to heaven. And I love that idea, because for Beethoven, it was caring about the middle class. It was caring about, obviously, universal brotherhood, as we all know from the Ninth Symphony. It was also engaging in Rousseau's ideals in the Age of Enlightenment, and the fact that the power of the individual could reign supreme, that music, that you could be the star of your own show, that you didn't need to be supported by aristocracy or by the church. And then, of course, just the thematic tightness, the motivic brilliance of his music. I mean, Beethoven has always been my goat, right? My greatest of all time. But no, but I think that I really like to listen to everything, and not to put two quotes in one of your answers, but Duke Ellington had that quote. There are two kinds of music: good music and bad music, right? So I think just find the good music.
Well, okay, so I'm going to slightly amend a couple of things you said, because
Okay.
I always say, and people have heard me say this at least 100 times on these broadcasts, that I grew up with the Duke Ellington rule that there are two kinds of music: good music and the other kind.
Oh, and that one. Okay. Whoops.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the way my dad told me about Beethoven and God was that Bach and Beethoven were God's feet, Mozart was in his lap.
Oh, that's it. It's a different quote, but that's a good one. Wait, say that again, actually. Hold on.
That Bach and Beethoven were God's feet, but Mozart was in God's lap.
Hmm. Interesting. Very
Yeah.
interesting.
I don't know if I agree with that, but I love my father, and he was one of my first musical teachers, and therefore I listened very carefully.
Right.
And but I certainly, back in July, Tony Bennett died, and Tony Bennett was another god of my household, because when you read about Tony Bennett, he may not have been that interesting talking about himself and his own music making, but he was remarkably perceptive about what everybody else was doing.
Right.
And if you listen to him talk about what Duke Ellington did, because Duke Ellington loved Tony Bennett, and Duke Ellington gave Tony Bennett one of the great pieces of advice that I've ever heard. It makes sense to me. I've kind of lived it, but Duke Ellington said it better, that you need always to do at least two things. Because if you run out of gas, or you become tired or dispirited and need recharging in the one thing, you do the other. So that in the case of Tony Bennett, he was a wonderful painter of landscapes and of portraits of musicians he admired. And he signed his paintings Benedetto, which was his original name. So when he was not singing, he lived not too far from where you are, and he had a terrace, and people who lived nearby would see Tony Bennett seated on his terrace, painting, not singing, not reading scores, not near the piano, but painting. And he would paint and paint and paint. And he started doing watercolors because he was on the road. And he said that oil paint doesn't work on hotel room floors and rugs, but water painting he could do. So he did gouaches and all these watercolor painting on the road, but did oil painting in his home. And for him, it was at least as meaningful to be a painter as it was to be a musician. And he learned that piece of advice from Duke Ellington, who, you're too young, but there are advantages to being my age. I went to Duke Ellington's funeral.
Wow.
Because it was in the Church of St. John the Divine on 110th Street, which is known as Duke Ellington Boulevard. And Ella Fitzgerald sang, and Duke Ellington wrote not only brilliant jazz and songs, but he did his interpretations, his transcriptions of Grieg, of all kinds of, but his Grieg is very famous. And he was just a genius musician who went to all these different places. He wrote ballets, operas, everything. And he's still undervalued. But I went to Ellington's funeral to honor him, but also, frankly, to hear the singers. So that's something we could do. Never mind Chopin's funeral, Duke Ellington's funeral.
I wish I could have been there. That's incredible.
Yeah, it was Church of St. John the Divine on 110th Street, Manhattan. Those of you listening elsewhere, this is what happens when New Yorkers get together and talk musical geography in our own city, of which there's a great deal. Llewellyn Sánchez Werner, this is just the beginning. I thank you for this visit today. You have provided Adagio visitors and readers with works by Schumann, Mozart, Beethoven, John Adams, and Chavez, and Carlos Chavez, about whom we spoke. And keep up the good work. Keep discovering new music. Keep being yourself, which is what I always say to people, because that's the most important thing, is you don't have to emulate others, but you have to find honor and be honest about your own voice. And I know that you do, which is why it was a pleasure to talk to you today. So thanks.
The pleasure really has been mine. You're a walking encyclopedia, but you're also a fun spirit. And those two things put together, it really has been a joy for me. So thanks for having me.
See you again. Take care.